Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all. I'm Becky Francis, Director of the UCL Institute of Education, and I really want to give you all a warm welcome to the IOE. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm really pleased to be introducing this evening's lecture as another opportunity to share our senior colleagues' research. Now, our speaker this evening is Alice Sullivan, Professor of Sociology and Director of the 1970 British Cohort Study based in the Centre for Longitudinal Studies here at the IOE. And Alice has asked me to warn you that there's an interactive element to today's lecture. I've said the Wi-Fi instructions are on your seats, so if you go into those, and I'm told, look up on your phones or whatever, menti.com, which is also up on the screen. Now, Alice's own life course led her to read philosophy, politics, and economics at Balliol College, Oxford, and then to Nuffield College to complete an MSc and DPhil in sociology. At the IOE, her research is focused on social and educational inequalities. And in that work, she's made extensive use of large-scale longitudinal data sets, in particular, the British birth cohort studies. She's going to say more about these studies, of course, in her lecture. It's suffice for me to say that these studies are, as many of you will know, the jewel in the crown of UK social science. And we're incredibly proud to host all 4 within UCL, 3 of those here at the IOE within the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. As well as these 1946, 1958, and 1970, and the Millennium Birth Cohort Studies, I should also mention the Next Step study, which CLS also runs, which began in 2004 with a cohort of 14-year-olds. Alice's lecture will touch on many of her research interests, from social class and gender differences in educational attainment to single-sex and coeducational schooling, private and grammar schools, cultural capital, and social mobility, as well as a particular focus for this evening, reading for pleasure. And with that, I'll hand over to Alice to tell us more. Alice, I'm really delighted to invite you to present your lecture. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Becky, for that kind introduction, and it's amazing to see so many people here, so thank you for coming and braving the rain to be here. The title of my lecture today is Inequalities in Education and Society, the Home, the School, and the Power of Reading. And as Becky warned you, there will be a little bit of interactivity. Don't worry, it's only going to be a couple of questions. But for those of you who do have smartphones, if you could be getting onto the Wi-Fi and getting onto menti.com, that would be great, and then you'll be prepared for that when it happens. So much of my work really concerns the way that advantage and disadvantage is passed down from one generation to the next. So why, for example, do working class kids do less well at school than middle class kids? And why is there a strong link between people's childhood socioeconomic circumstances and where they end up in terms of their destinations in adult life? And sociologists often talk about this in terms of the OED triangle, where O is social origins in childhood, so things like your parents' social class, income, educational level. E is your own educational attainment. And D is your destination in adult life, whether we define that in terms of social class or income or wealth. And social reproduction occurs when there's a tight bond between social origins and social destinations, whereas social mobility is when that bond is broken by a move either up or down the socioeconomic ladder. So So in my lecture tonight, I'm going to talk about a range of interrelated topics that I've worked on through my career. So I'm going to start by talking about education and something called cultural capital, and I'll come back to what we mean by cultural capital. I'll move on to talk about different kinds of secondary school that children attend, whether it's coeducational and single-sex schools or private grammar and state schools, how that relates to their educational attainment, and then how that then relates to their social mobility or social reproduction chances later in life. I'm then going to talk about learning and specifically the role of reading for pleasure in learning both during the childhood years and then during adult life. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the intergenerational transmission of language from parents to children. So I'm going to start at the beginning with my doctoral work, which I did at Oxford in the late 90s. And I was interested in why there are social class differences in educational attainment. And I was attracted to a theory by a French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, called cultural reproduction theory, which laid a heavy emphasis on something called cultural capital. And I guess being someone who'd grown up in a household with a lot of books and not that much money, it seemed plausible and intuitive to me that there's more to educational attainment than financial investment. But what is this thing called cultural capital? So, well, this is how Pierre Bourdieu defines it. The education system demands of everyone alike that they have what it does not give. This consists mainly of linguistic and cultural competence, and that relationship of familiarity with culture, which can only be produced by family upbringing when it transmits the dominant culture. Well, it's a bit of a mouthful, and perhaps that might seem as clear as mud. I did actually try to find the clearest possible quote from Bourdieu, but he's not renowned for his lucid prose. So although I found this idea kind of intuitively plausible, I wasn't very satisfied with the sort of vagueness of Bourdieu's kind of exposition of it. I really wanted to kind of pin it down a bit more clearly. So how do you measure cultural capital? Well, it seemed to me that it was divided into activities, but also language ability and cultural knowledge. And most of the previous research, particularly quantitative research that had been done previously, really focused on the activities and focused on particular kinds of activities like what you would call high culture, I suppose, going to art galleries and museums, playing a classical musical instrument, that kind of thing. And I really felt that this was possibly missing something, that there might be other things that people did that were more important, for example, reading or the kind of TV programs that people were watching. And I was interested in how those cultural activities might get under the skin and become knowledge and language. And so this was my first experience of survey research. I went out into schools, into secondary schools, and did a survey of around 500 school children in their final GCSE year and asked them about their activities, their knowledge, tested them on their cultural knowledge and on their language. And the test of cultural knowledge was actually probably the most distinctive thing in this survey. So I thought you, being a very cultured audience, might like to have a try at the hardest question. So this was one that almost all of the 16-year-olds got wrong. So we'll see how you do. So if you go to menti.com and put in the code 140873, I'm going to ask you this cultural knowledge quiz question. And then while you're on there, I'll ask you a vocabulary question, which will become relevant later, and we'll come back to it. Okay. So, which is Martin Amis associated with? So it's a multiple choice question. is he associated with science, novels, politics, music, or art? Well done. So 53% of you got it right. Or is that percent or is that no? That's probably the number of people, isn't it? So very well done. While you're here, I want to ask you a tough vocabulary question. So what does pusillanimous mean? It's another multiple choice one. Does it mean loud, living, timid, averse, or correct? Don't tell each other the answer. So you did very, very well there, because the 16-year-olds back in the late 90s, only 5% of them could identify that Martin Amis was the novelist. And at the time, he was really meant to be quite famous. So he'd just been given a $500,000 advance by his publisher, and it was quite scandalous that he was supposed to have spent the whole thing on cosmetic dentistry. But, you know, so he was in the news and so on, but no one knew who he was. He couldn't compare to the likes of Charles Dickens and so on, who were kind of well known. Then if we go to politics, the best known person in the whole survey, Bill Clinton, obviously well known for more than one reason in the late 90s, and nearly everyone knew who he was, but Karl Marx, only about a quarter of them knew who Karl Marx was. So it's kind of interesting, because I think there are certain elements of our cultural knowledge that within our bubbles we kind of assume are universal, and they actually aren't universal culture. They're specific culture that's specific to particular groups of people that tend to know these things. And in terms of the wider findings from the research, what we found was that particular types of cultural activity, and specifically reading, fed into young people's cultural knowledge and their verbal ability, and those in turn fed in to their GCSE results when I followed them up later on to find out their GCSE results. And that was quite important, because it was saying that actually what's important in cultural capital is not this high culture, it's the kinds of culture like reading which actually develop your language and develop your knowledge. And we actually we developed this cultural knowledge quiz a few years later for the Oxford University admissions study, and found that again a much harder version of this test was quite predictive of who got into Oxford and who didn't, even when you took into account all their A-level results and IQ scores and so on. So, moving on from my Oxford days, I came in 2003 to the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. Now, this photo is a bit unfortunate because it gives the impression I only own one outfit, which is not true. But this is the fantastic team of people that I have been working with over the years, not absolutely everybody in this picture. And some of you will know very well what we do at the centre, and some of you won't have any idea. So we run a series of longitudinal studies, and what does longitudinal mean? Well, it means that you follow people over time, so you follow them throughout their lives. And Britain is incredibly fortunate in having an amazing series of birth cohort studies, which follow people not just longitudinally, but actually from the start of life, from birth. And the first of those studies started just after the war in 1946, which is just an extraordinary achievement to think of people doing that in such difficult circumstances. And here at the Institute of Education, at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, we hold the 1958 cohort, the 1970 cohort, the Millennium Cohort, which are all birth cohorts, and also Next Steps, which is a school childhood cohort. And I'm privileged to be the director of the 1970 birth cohort study. Now you can see that these cohorts have kind of weathered different circumstances over the years, And you can see that there are some gaps. So between 1970 and 2000, there's a huge gap where we missed a generation and there was no birth cohort study. And we can perhaps blame this person over here because there was no such thing as society in the 80s. The idea that it would be an incredibly rich and powerful thing to find what the children of the 80s are doing now was not appealing to everybody. And so that's a shame. There's a real gap there, albeit a gap that's partially filled by the Next Step study. And you'll see also that the Millennium Cohort was a bit of a while ago now. And my goodness, hasn't life changed and haven't lots of dramatic things happened in the interim? So I think it's about time that we got on with a new birth cohort study. But that's something perhaps we can come back to. So in what follows this evening, I'm going to use all three of the birth cohort studies. I have used all four of the data sets that we hold here during my career, but I'm just going to talk about work involving the 1958 birth cohort study, which follows 17,000 people born in a single week of 1958. The 1970 study, which I direct, which follows more than 17,000 people again, followed again in a single week. And then the Millennium Cohort study, which follows children born around the millennium. And each of these studies follows people regularly, at regular intervals throughout their lives. So if we take the 1970 as an example, we took data and spoke to the mothers and the parents of the cohort when they were children, spoke to their teachers as they went through. They had medical tests, they did cognitive assessments, and they've been revisited every few years, and we will be going back to them again next year when they will be having their 50th birthdays. Oops. So one of the first projects that I took part in when I came to the Centre for Longitudinal Studies was using the 1958 cohort to look at single-sex and coeducational schooling. And this was with Heather Joshi and our sadly now late colleague Diana Leonard. And we were interested in what the impact of single-sex and coeducational schooling had been on boys and girls' educational attainment and other outcomes. Because this is something that people have had a lot of very strong opinions about without necessarily providing really solid evidence. And when we think back to when the 58 cohort were at school in the 60s and 70s, there was a kind of standard progressive view that coeducational schooling was the progressive way, single-sex schooling was, perhaps a bit old-fashioned, a bit reactionary. And this, on the other hand, this had been challenged by feminists who were worried that girls might be. But the kind of standard progressive view was expressed very strongly by someone called R.R. Dale, who was the kind of top expert on single-sex and coeducational schooling at the time. And he said, a family has a father and a mother. Lacking one of these, each feels incomplete and unsatisfied. So it is with other institutions when they are one sex, as we know from the homosexual activities in public school. So that counted as woke in 1969. But as I say, some feminists have challenged that view, but we just saw it as an empirical question. We're really interested to find out, well, does it make a difference? And what we found was that actually it did make a difference for girls and not for boys, whether they were in coeducational or single-sex schools. Girls did a bit better overall in their O-level results, but it made a difference for both sexes in terms of their subject passes. So if we look at A-level subject passes, girls in single-sex schools were more likely than girls in coeducational schools to do science A-levels. Whereas if we look at boys, boys in single-sex schools were more likely to get language passes than boys in coeducational schools. So I found this really quite surprising and startling, that actually it seemed to be that it was actually within the coeducational schools that these gender stereotypes were stronger than they were in the single-sex schools. And that was actually affecting the subjects that not just girls, but girls and boys were taking. But of course, in the British context, when we think about schooling and social, it's the private schools and the selective schools that we tend to focus on. So our ruling elite tends to have a certain kind of educational background, shall we say. Remember him? That was David Cameron. And this one down here is Who's Next? So that's our meritocracy in 2019. Boris could make an interesting study, I think, because apparently he's had rumoured to have lots of children by a range of different mothers. Who knows, they might end up in all sorts of different schools. It could be quite interesting. So in this project, we were interested in how schooling relates to social class, particularly with a focus on the kind of top end, and how what school you go to relates to the education you receive after school, and then your destinations after that. So, first of all, looking at the 1970 cohort, how many of them went to university according to the type of secondary school they'd been to? Well, those who've been to private schools, about 60% or more than 60% of them went on to university, compared to about 20% for those at comprehensive. So it's a big, big difference. But it's also a sort of double whammy, because for those who went to private schools, they were much more likely to go to the most selective universities, so what we now call Russell Group universities, those who self-define as the kind of the best, the most elite universities. And whereas, so nearly half of those who went to university from private school went to those kinds of universities, compared to about a quarter at comprehensives. So, sorry, this is the science bit. This is it's a structural equation model, but don't let that worry you if you don't know what one is. Basically, what we're doing here is looking at the link between socioeconomic status at birth, in childhood, and who ends up in the top social class by midlife, so by age 42 for the 1970 cohort. And along the way, there are various things that connect the dots between childhood status and adult status. So your test scores when you're at school at age 5 and 10, whether you go to a private school is obviously very strongly linked to your socioeconomic status. And then all of those things feed in very strongly to your qualifications at 42, broadly defined. So levels, A levels, whether you went to university, what subject you did, which university you went to, throwing it all in there. And when you throw all that in there, it is absolutely the key determinant of getting into the top social class at 42, and explains fully the link with socioeconomic status. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that link between socioeconomic origins and qualifications, but qualifications does explain that link. In contrast, if we look at the relationship between being female and being in the top social class at 42, which is powerfully negative, that is not explained in any way by education, however carefully we measure education, however much we take into account subject choices, as well as the level of attainment. So we then compared the 70 cohort with the 58 cohort, and there's been a lot of interest in social mobility and whether it's stayed the same or gone up or gone down between these two cohorts. And part of the reason for that level of interest is because something that changed between those two generations was a decline in grammar schools and an increase in comprehensive schools. So we were interested not so much in the absolute level of social mobility and whether it had gone up or down, but in whether these pathways had changed. And we found some quite interesting differences. So, for example, the private schools became much more academically selective. So having a high cognitive score became a more important predictor of getting into a private school, and having a high socioeconomic status became a less powerful predictor. And the private schools also started to focus much more on getting good qualifications for the children who went there. And that will have been in response to market parents were really demanding in a context where the option of grammar schooling was less likely to be there. We also found that differentials in cognitive scores in childhood became less unequal for the 1970 cohort, but that those cognitive scores were then less important in predicting your educational attainment, which again makes sense because if your cognitive scores aren't determining whether you go to a selective school or not, that will have less impact on where you end up. So there were lots of changes in these pathways, and yet ultimately we did not find any overall change in the link between socioeconomic status in childhood and destinations in adulthood, whether we defined those in terms of pay or social class. So a great deal can change in the education system with all sorts of interesting ramifications without levels of social mobility necessarily changing at all. More advantaged families will find different ways through the system and end up with the same results, essentially. So moving on to talk about learning, because of course education is not is not just a positional good which exists to get you a particular kind of job. And one of the amazing things that you can do with the birth cohort studies or with any longitudinal data is look at learning, because that's looking at change over time in how children are doing. So this is some research which I did with my colleague Matt Brown on reading for pleasure and how that influenced both vocabulary and mathematics scores up to age 16. And then subsequently we followed it up to look right into midlife at age 42 and see how reading for pleasure influenced people's learning after they had left school. So first of all, what does reading look like at age 10? Well, it looks pretty positive at age 10, so this would have been in 1980. Most children are reading. Very few, even among those whose parents have no qualifications, you've only got a very small minority who are never or hardly ever reading. That said, of course, there is a gap, and those with high levels of parental qualifications are more likely to be reading a lot. Then by the time we get to age 16 in 1986, things look not so good. So there's far more young people who say they're rarely or never reading, and quite a big gap between those, so 45% of those whose parents have no qualifications rarely or never read for pleasure, compared to 19% of those whose parents have a degree. But what was really powerful that came out of this study was just how influential reading for pleasure was on children's outcomes, not just in terms of their vocabulary scores, but their math scores at age 16. So we controlled for a whole range of factors, so all of the cognitive scores that the children had done at the ages of 5 and 10, a whole range of controls for socioeconomic background and their family characteristics. And what this shows you is what's happening above and beyond that in terms of what influenced vocabulary and maths. And what you can see is that both reading at 10 and reading both books and newspapers at 16 are really influential. And what was most startling to us was that taking those measures together, they were 4 times more influential on the test scores than parents' education. And as a sociologist of education that normally expects parents' education to be the biggest predictor of everything, that was quite a startling result. So then we followed this up into adulthood, and what was really nice was that we were able to do the same vocabulary test that the 1970 cohort had done when they were 16, and they actually repeated the same test at age 42. And we asked them lots of questions about reading for pleasure when they were 42 as well. So the vocabulary test, here are some of the tougher questions, and the one that you have answered, of course, is pusillanimous. Does it mean loud, living, timid, averse, or correct? So let's go and find out how you did on that. Very good. So 33% got it right. That's much better than the cohort members did either at 16 or at 42. About 20% of them got it right. So you've considerably outperformed them. And of course, for those of you who didn't know the answer, that's fantastic because it means that you've learned a new word. So this evening has actually been worthwhile for you. So just to remind you, this is the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz, just so that you will never forget the meaning of the word pusillanimous. So one piece of good news from this study was that actually learning doesn't stop when you leave school. It's not all downhill as you go into midlife. Our study members learned lots of new words between the ages of 16 and 42, so they did quite a bit better at 42. And also reports of the death of reading for pleasure have been greatly exaggerated. So particularly among women, about 1/3 of them said that they read for pleasure every day or almost every day, and it's about 20% of men. We were also really interested in what kind of reading they did, because maybe it matters not just that you are reading, but that you're reading particular kinds of books. And so we asked them about different genres, and we were interested in how reading those genres varied by educational status. So if we take crime, for example, that's the most popular genre for everybody, regardless of their educational level. But some genres look quite different from that. So if we take contemporary literary fiction, so that's things like Martin Amis, for example, those who had a Russell Group degree, so a kind of a fancy degree, nearly half of them said that they liked contemporary literary fiction. And those with degrees from other institutions, it was down to 30%. So even within the graduate population, you see this massive cultural differentiation. And other genres look quite different. So if you take romance, for example, it's people with middling levels of qualifications that said that they liked romance. And it mattered. So again, controlling for a whole range of factors and looking at progress in vocabulary between the ages of 16 and 42. Who learned the most new words? Well, people who had been readers at age 10 and age 16, it made a difference at age 42. Reading frequently at age 42 also made a difference. And in particular, reading highbrow fiction, even more so than highbrow factual, made the biggest difference to people's word power in midlife. So it matters not just that you read, but what you read, which makes sense when you think about the kinds of words that you're exposed to in different kinds of reading. And this it was very pleasing that it was really picked up in a big way by libraries, by literacy associations, by schools, who found it really, really useful. And I think the reason they found it useful was that ultimately what this is saying is learning is about more than just cramming for tests. And time spent reading for pleasure is not time wasted, because this is an incredibly powerful driver of learning. It's not just an indulgence. So the last project that I'm going to talk to you about is using the Millennium Cohort. So you might be thinking, well, okay, that's all very well for people who are now in midlife, but what about young people today? And excitingly, we were able to use the same vocabulary test that we had used for the 1970 cohort, not just for the 14-year-olds in the Millennium Cohort study, but also for their parents. So that gives us a unique resource of a very large data set, which includes vocabulary scores for both parents and children. And that's really exciting when you think that a lot of the work in this field has been based on really small samples. So, for example, a hugely influential study by Hart and Risley, the early catastrophe, the 30 million word gap by age 3, was based on, I think, 42 families in one US college town. So although it's a really important study, the power of actually being able to look at these questions with 19,000 families is an incredible thing that the Millennium Cohort gives us. So the 14-year-olds and their mothers and the mothers' partners all did subsets of the vocabulary test. So they had subsets of words. So, and you can see the ones that were easy are big in this diagram, and the hard words are correspondingly small. So you can see that words like conceal and quick were easy, whereas words like indifferent and prosaic were hard. For the mothers, it was discipline and moan that were easy, and sensual was hard. We didn't deliberately put hidden messages in these tests. And then again, for the partner, it's inevitable fatigue and anguish. And then the hard word tucked over the apostate. That's a lovely word, isn't it? So, of course, we found inequalities in how the parents did in these vocabulary scores. You would absolutely expect that. So, taking parents who had higher degrees, for example, they scored about twice as high on this test as parents who had no qualifications. But on a more positive note, the gaps between the children are much smaller than the gaps between the parents. Similarly, when we look at ethnicity, there are some ethnic groups that on the parents' generation are doing much, much better than others. So whites and people of mixed race, for example, doing far better than Bangladeshi parents. But when we look at the gaps between the children, they're actually really small, and that's because the Bangladeshi, the young person in the Bangladeshi households is actually doing better than the parents on this test of English vocabulary. So what were the pathways from maternal education to child vocabulary? Well, both the mother's and the partner's education were very strongly linked to vocabulary. So this is important. It's an important part of what the advantage of education is that people pass down to their children. And vocabulary, in turn, is linked to things like having lots of books at home, reading to your child when they're young, and the child's own reading for pleasure. And all of those things feed into the child's vocabulary. Again, we found that other forms of cultural capital, or what's often called cultural capital, for example, playing a musical instrument, was not so important in determining children's language. So culture matters, but it's particular kinds of culture, and particularly reading, which matters for language development. So I seem to have rattled through that much faster than I thought I possibly would. To bring it together, I've talked first of all about social mobility, and secondly about language and learning. But I think that the two things are related. Looking at social mobility, there's a huge focus on social mobility in the education system. And yet, what I think I've shown, and it's not just in my research, but in other people's research too, I think, is that dramatic changes to the education system don't necessarily have the powerful effects on social mobility that people think that they will have. And looking at the decline of the grammar schools, both the pro and anti-grammar school lobby would have predicted very dramatic changes. And actually what we saw instead was a change in the process by which advantage and disadvantage is transmitted, and not a change in the level. So the education system, although education for individuals is absolutely the key to adult destinations, the education system doesn't necessarily change overall macro levels of social mobility. And perhaps in some ways, as people who care about education, we shouldn't put as much focus on that as we sometimes do. And I think there's two reasons I'd suggest that. One is something that the sociologist Christopher Jenks said, which is that the point about inequality is not to randomize it, it's to reduce it. And the other is that education is not just a positional good. So it's not just about how you get a better job, how you get a better income. It's actually about learning, it's about independent thinking, reading, and imagination. And if we think of education purely in terms of social mobility, then we lose something really important, which is actually the fundamental of what education is about. So finally, even though this has been a bit of a sort of greatest hits style of lecture, there are lots of important collaborations and lots of important projects that I have left out. And so I want to thank everyone that I've co-authored with over the years. And this is, I think, a complete list in chronological rather than alphabetical order. I would say also, I've been at the Institute of Education probably longer than I would care to remember now, and yet there are always new and sometimes unexpected collaborations around the corner. And I'm really grateful for the scholarly collaborations, the intellectual collaborations, but also the collegial support and friendship that I've experienced here. I'd also say, having been introduced by Becky and about to pass on to Heather, that the Institute of Education is really an amazing powerhouse of strong women, and I'm really grateful for the sisterhood and the amazing role models that I've had, including Heather, of course, who's about to come on next. Thank you.
Alice, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I mean, we were riveted. It's been fantastic. Fascinating findings. I think we've learned so much about the impact of cultural capital and which capitals, and what an exemplar of the importance and power of the birth cohort studies as well. Really challenging findings too for educationalists, policymakers and practitioners in relation to the consequences of those challenging findings you've presented. Many of us have learnt a new word, I confess, myself included, and we've also thought about a Boris cohort study, so that's also exciting. Thank you, that was really terrific. And I'm honoured now to introduce our respondent for this evening's lecture, Heather Joshi, Emeritus Professor of Economic and Developmental Demography here at the IOE. Now, like Alice, Heather's research has drawn primarily on large longitudinal data sets to reveal patterns and correlations. In Heather's case, in relation to the interactions between childbearing, employment, earnings, and child development. Heather has also been a pioneering figure in relation to cohort and longitudinal studies. From 1994 to 2010, Heather was Deputy Director and then Director of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. And she's variously served as Founder President of the Society for Longitudinal and Life Course Studies, President of the European Society for Population Economics and of the British Society for Population Studies, and co-chair of the European Child Cohort Network. So a hugely influential figure. And Heather's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the British Academy. Her scholarly contribution was also recognised in 2015 when she was awarded a CBE for services to longitudinal and women's studies. As I say, Heather, it's a real honour to have you respond to this evening's lecture. Can I invite you to the stage?
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Alice, for your lecture. And now everyone else can know what a role model looks like. I've also got a joke about Boris before we get on to. I have many co-authors, one of whom is an economist who went to Balliol, and he is absolutely dismayed about Alice and his classmate now being a candidate for Prime Minister. So perhaps we can do something about that. Unfortunately, he hasn't been chucked out of the Tory ballot this afternoon. But life is full of Balliol men and women. So I thought that my response to Alice's lecture was not to pick holes in it, but to help you retain the outline and structure of what she was talking about by sort of going through the main points to fix them in your minds like the world in your minds, which are not at all pusillanimous after your training. So Alice started out explaining very clearly how a sociologist like herself and others start with theory, and she has presented and explored the theory which generates the concept of cultural capital, and her early research, empirical and theoretical, implemented this idea. She arrived at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies in 2003, as she said, and was engaged in lots of work, in addition to the project that she's told you about, which was the work that she and Dinah Leonard and I did looking at single sex and coeducation amongst the cohort born in 1958. An interesting thing about this project is that our learned articles have attracted an enormous amount of attention, not from academic readers and citers, but from practitioners, teachers, and the general public. And we got quite a lot of correspondence from people asking us to settle family disputes about what kind of school their daughter should go to, for example. So when you think about the impact of Alice's work, look beyond the narrow academic metrics, because in this project and in the project that she told us about, vocabulary, it's had a huge popular interest and impact as well. The next major project that she told us about was looking at the type of school and its consequences for individuals in midlife, in which Boris appears again. The public school does not fade away by any means, and their very careful work with a lot of evidence is extremely important. Private schooling may not be the only route to the top, but it still helps. Then she moves on to research that she's done, trying to get, as she said, under the skin of this process by which your family origins work their way through to success in midlife via educational qualifications, in the section headed Reading and Learning, and she's given us information about the reading habits of 10-year-olds, 16-year-olds, and their connection with the vocabulary of those same people when they were 42, also drawn from the 1970 cohort. The next part of her lecture focuses on research on the transmission of language between generations. And it moves on to the third cohort she's talked about, the Millennium Cohort. And we can see a strong social pattern in the vocabulary of the parents of this cohort, but not such a strong social pattern amongst the 14-year-olds who she quite rightly calls young people, because they certainly wouldn't call themselves children. And from there, she draws her conclusions from this series of studies about how language, vocabulary, and reading is part of the social fabric. I see this fabric as having a pattern which plays a part in entrenched inequalities, but may also play a part in mobilities away from social origins. Recreational reading appears both as an investment in social capital and as consumption. It's a win-win. No wonder so many people hit the website. I quote, "Read like a butterfly and write like a bee." This was said by the novelist Philip Pullman in recommending browsing in a public library for, quotes, "broadening the mind and bringing unexpected pleasures." Though sadly it's not a growth industry at present, public libraries should have the potential to modify the links that we have seen between poor origins and poor vocabulary. As she also intimated, she's just taken us on a journey through one strand of her research. And like everybody else in the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, our work has interdisciplinary facets. As director of the 1970 cohort, Alice has presided over a biomedical survey of the cohort at age 46 and is preparing for a new wave of data collection at age 50 in 2020. And she's also taking the lead in preparing the case to keep the series of birth cohort studies going, taking births from a year in the early 2020s and repairing the missing cohort by recruiting a catch-up cohort of school children who were born in the missing 2010s. We can't promise that this will happen, but it certainly won't if we don't get our report in at the end of this month. So I hope you will all support these continuing endeavours, both in data collection and in social science. Thank you, and thank you, Alice.
Enormous thanks to you, Heather. We certainly shall endeavour to support that important work. Thank you. And thanks for highlighting again the profound impact that Alice's work has had. It's been a terrific evening. Thanks very much for your warm participation and presence as well. And there's nothing more for me to say and do except to welcome you all to share with us a drink outside, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, where we can toast Alice's work. Thank you again.